I want to take a few minutes to answer the question, does the Bible support slavery? Now, for most Christians, we would categorically say, no, the Bible does not support slavery. But unfortunately, it's becoming very, very prevalent among secularists. If you go to YouTube and you put in slavery in the Bible, you're going to get 50 videos where they're claiming that the Bible does support slavery and one video of a Christian refuting that claim. The fact is, there are some very difficult scriptures, and we're going to look at two of the most difficult scriptures, and it makes it very tough. It stumbles up a lot of Christians when they get into these discussions. So right now, we're going to just really address this very, very quickly. In our course, Introduction to Apologetics, we go in a little more depth, but we're going to give you really a strong tools to be able to refute this claim that the Bible supports slavery. The biggest problem we have with this question is that when it's posed, the secularist will put it in the content of 21st century America. In other words, that everything that should have been happening then is what is happening today. But the fact is, in ancient Israel, there were no civil courts, there were no human resources departments, there was no employment opportunities, there was no minimum wages, on and on and on. And so there was very little protection in the ancient world for slaves. This makes it very, very difficult because, once again, we want to address this in a 21st century way. We expect the Bible to be speaking to someone in the 21st century, but it is not. The Bible, we know, came about in very ancient civilization. And so we have to kind of put it in content first when you're having these conversations. So in a perfect world, you're going to set some ground rules before you go into these conversations. So let me go through a few of those ground rules. If you can establish them, good. Then we're going to go right into the actual scriptures. Number one, you can hopefully agree with whoever you're talking to that slavery was widespread and practiced in every ancient civilization, whether it was the Aztecs here in the Americas, whether it was the Egyptians, whether it was the Romans. It was common, it was universal, and it was practiced everywhere. The next rule that you want to hopefully come to terms with is there was no legal or economic system to protect slaves. There was nothing. There was no court system. There was no human resource department. There was no labor laws. None of it was there to protect slaves. So again, the Bible comes into the world, into that world. It does not come into the 21st century. Next, that slavery was often necessary for individuals to avoid starvation. Back in the ancient world, if you didn't have tools, if you didn't have land, if you didn't have livestock, it was very likely that you were going to face starvation at one point or another. And slavery, we know through the historical record, not only biblical, that people would sell themselves to a master who had all these resources, and they would buy that slave for a certain time period, and that slave was able to sustain himself and his family. So it was an economic system, and again, very few historians would disagree with that. Next, that when the Hebrews came out of Egypt, they were a band of barbarians. The new Hebrew laws were designed to bring them into civility. They were barbarians, and these laws came in to really bring them under control. And finally, that the biblical revelation is progressive. That is, if you look at the divorce, it is allowed in Deuteronomy 24:1, and then divorce is subsequently prohibited in Matthew chapter 19, verse 8. So the revelation in the Bible is progressive, and we know that. And in this particular case, it's progressive as the Israelites set up their civil systems, then we can move to more detailed laws. But at the time that these laws came into effect, again, we were dealing with a band of barbarians. So now, let's look at some of the toughest scriptures. We're going to look at the two most prevalent ones that the atheists love to throw out there. This first one can be found in Leviticus chapter 25, verse 45. And here's how it reads. Moreover, you may buy the children of the stranger who dwell among you and their families who are with you, which they beget in your land, and they shall become your property. So that's very, very tough. You know, again, when a Christian sees that verse, it's hard to make an argument against the fact that the Bible may endorse slavery. But let me now read from Exodus chapter 21, verse 16. And he that stealeth a man and selleth him, or if he be found in his hand, he shall surely be put to death. The laws of Exodus said that you cannot steal a man. Man stealing, as we know slavery today from the African slave trade, was prohibited. Slavery had to be voluntary from both parties. It was punishable by death. That if you stole someone, as it happened in the African slave trade, you would be put to death. Okay? So, again, we have to read these scriptures in the content of all the scriptures. Next, Colossians chapter 4, verse 1, require just and fair payment to slaves. Therefore, it's a relationship more akin to employment contract rather than racial slavery. So, the laws of the Bible required not only that if you buy someone, that you pay that person. Okay? So let's look at the toughest one now, which can be found in Exodus chapter 21, verse 20 through verse 21. And here it is quoted. And if a man beats his male or female servant with a rod so that he dies under his hand, he shall surely be punished. So you're beating this slave and he dies, you're going to be punished. Notwithstanding, if he remains alive a day or two, he shall not be punished, for he is his property. So what the atheist will tell you is that you can beat a slave just to the point of death, and if he doesn't die, then you are off scot-free. Now, here's the problem with the atheist claim, is that they're taking the scripture out of content. If you read all the scriptures above it and below it, it's specifically talking about the death penalty. And these are the things that are punishable by death. So let me put it in 21st century content. If a man beats his wife and she does not die, he will not get the death penalty. Of course he won't. If she doesn't die, he won't get the death penalty. Now, there are many, many other laws that will punish him for beating her. But it's not talking about that in this content. Again, all you have to do is read the scriptures above it. And let me read some of them. Verse 12 said, he that smiteth a man so that he die shall surely be put to death. Verse 15, and he that smiteth his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. Verse 16, and he that stealeth a man and selleth him shall surely be put to death. And it just goes on, and it's talking about the death penalty. So once again, in Exodus chapter 21, which is their favorite verse, they're taking it completely out of content, and they are really distorting it. Let me read from Exodus chapter 21, verse 26 through 27. This is right after that one. If a man strikes the eye of a male or a female servant and destroys it, he shall let him go free for the sake of his eye. And if he knocks out the tooth of a male or female servant, he shall let him go free for the sake of his tooth. So this is right after that verse. So once again, what they've done here clearly is they've lifted that verse out of scripture and taken it out of content and said, look, you can beat your slave and you won't be punished. And that is not the case at all. So while the Old Testament does allow slavery only under Jewish law, is there a deliberate attempt to safeguard the slave against brutality? And we have lots of verses that actually give the slave more protection. So again, the Bible's coming into the world. There's no protection for slaves, and that we see now, if you actually go and look at all the verses that are talking about the slave, they're giving them added protection. Now, do they set up a minimum wage? No, they do not. Do they establish employment courts? No, they don't. But we know that in the Bible, they get additional protections. Let's read some of them. Deuteronomy 23:15 protects the slave who has escaped. So as a slave, if you escaped, there was protection for you, because once again, man stealing was prohibited. Slavery had to be voluntary. Exodus 21, verse 2 requires the release of slave after 7 years. Exodus 21, verse 7 through 11 protects female slaves from unjust treatment and provides redemption. Leviticus 25, verse 6 tells the Israelites to treat the slave as extended family. Colossians 4, verse 1 requires just and fair payment. Exodus 21:20 requires capital punishment for anyone who kills a slave. So the slave had equality. You kill a slave, you get put to death as well. There was this attempt to make them equal with the master. And Ephesians chapter 6, verse 9 prohibited threatening. Some will conclude that the Bible does not speak out strongly enough about slavery, but that's just not true, because verses like love your neighbor, do good to those who do bad to you. I mean, on and on and on. You've got to look at these scriptures in light of the entire content of the Bible, and all of these verses apply to the Israelites, to your neighbor, to the people in the church, and to strangers. Let me read now from Deuteronomy chapter 24, verse 14 through 15. You shall not oppress a hired servant who is poor and needy, whether one of your brethren or one of the aliens who is in your land within your gates. Each day you shall give him his wages and not let the sun go down on it, for he is poor and has set his heart on it, lest he cry out against you to the Lord and it be sin to you. So once again, the Bible required the payment, and it says here, aliens or brethren, to everyone who is under your control. So while the Bible does, condones slavery, it's not the kind of slavery that we are familiarized with. Again, the African slave trade being the most hideous of them all, where in fact men were stolen, women were stolen, brought here against their will, and kept working against their will and with no payment. So it's nothing like that. It's more, again, of an economic system where people had no other alternative but to starve or to sell themselves into slavery, where they would receive a payment and work under certain terms. And it's no different or that different from, say, an NBA player who sells himself to an NBA team for a certain time. That person can get traded, that person's contract can expire, and what have you. So it's more in tune to an economic system than what we know today as slavery. So hopefully that will be helpful when you're discussing these issues. It's extremely prevalent right now. I can't tell you how many atheists I've met who their primary argument against Christianity is this idea that Christianity supports slavery.